You remember small things, not dramatic things, not the kind of moments people usually stop to record, just details that stayed with you because you happened to be paying attention. The order of a conversation, the way a sentence was said, the quiet shift in the room when something ordinary suddenly wasn't. At first, remembering felt simple. Something happened, and later you could recall it. Not perfectly, not like a recording, but well enough to recognize the shape of it. A conversation on Tuesday. A promise made while standing near the kitchen counter. A question you asked that didn't seem unusual at the time. You noticed that when these moments came up again, the version in the room sometimes sounded slightly different. Not completely different, just adjusted in small ways. The timing shifted. A sentence disappeared. A detail that had seemed clear to you was treated as if it had never been part of the moment at all. The first time it happened, it barely registered. People remember things differently sometimes. That seemed normal enough. A small difference in how something was recalled didn't feel important. Conversations move quickly. Words blur together. Nobody expects perfect agreement about every detail. But the difference returned. Another moment. Another conversation that seemed to bend slightly when it was described again later. The shape of it was close to what you remembered, but not close enough to sit comfortably beside it. You noticed the adjustments quietly. You didn't argue about them. Most of the time, there wasn't even a clear moment to object. The conversation would continue as if the revised version had always been the one everyone agreed on. Eventually, you became aware of something simple. The room seemed comfortable with the version that moved forward, the one that required the least correction, the one that fit easily with what everyone else was already saying. Your version didn't fit. You didn't begin by studying it. The differences were small enough that they seemed like ordinary mistakes. People forget things. People mix up the order of events. A sentence gets shortened when someone repeats it later. A detail fades when it doesn't seem important anymore. None of that felt unusual. So when a moment came up again and sounded slightly different from what you remembered, you didn't stop the conversation to examine it. You assumed the gap was natural. Memory moves around a little. That seemed reasonable. Over time, you noticed something quiet about these moments. The adjustments rarely happened in isolation. They appeared in similar places, around similar kinds of conversations. A decision that had once seemed clear would later sound less certain. A sentence you remembered hearing would be repeated in a softer version or not mentioned at all. The changes were rarely large enough to argue about. Most of the time, they arrived in the middle of ordinary conversation where nobody was pausing long enough to compare versions carefully. The room moved forward without hesitation. You would hear the revised version and feel a small pause inside yourself. Not a strong objection, just a brief moment of noticing. Sometimes you tried to bring up the detail you remembered, not as a correction, just as an addition. The response was usually calm. Someone would repeat the new version again, slightly more confidently this time, as if it had already been settled. The conversation would continue from there. Eventually, you began to notice that the adjustments had a direction. They tended to move the same way. They simplified things. They smoothed over rough edges. They made earlier moments sound easier than they had felt at the time. You didn't point this out very often. The room didn't seem interested in stopping to examine those differences. After a while, you began to recognize a quiet pattern. The version that stayed in the conversation was the one that created the least friction. After a while, you stopped expecting the moment to settle in the way you remembered it. The difference had appeared enough times that you began to anticipate it. A conversation would return to something that had already happened, and before anyone spoke, you could already feel a small hesitation forming inside you. Not a strong reaction, just a quiet pause. You would remember the earlier moment clearly enough to recognize its shape, the order of the sentences, the way the room had felt when something was said, the small details that had seemed ordinary at the time. But when the moment came up again, you noticed yourself waiting, not to hear the version you remembered, but to hear the version that would be spoken. Sometimes it was close to what you expected. Sometimes it shifted in small ways. A sentence shortened, a detail softened. Something that had once sounded direct, now appearing less certain. You began to notice that your first instinct was no longer to speak. Instead, you paused and listened. You measured the room before deciding whether your version had a place inside the conversation. Often, it didn't seem necessary to add it. The discussion had already moved forward on the version that was now being repeated. The room sounded comfortable with it. You noticed yourself doing a small calculation in those moments. You compared what you remembered with what was now being said. You considered whether the difference was worth interrupting the flow of the conversation. Most of the time, it wasn't, so you let the moment pass. Over time, this became something you did without thinking. When a conversation returned to the past, you listened first. You checked the direction the room was taking before deciding how much of your memory to include. Sometimes you adjusted the wording slightly. Sometimes you shortened the detail. Sometimes you left it out entirely. Eventually, you noticed something quieter than the conversations themselves. You had started checking the room before trusting what you remembered. Over time, you began to notice something that did not arrive as a sudden realization. It appeared slowly, the way a pattern becomes visible only after you have seen the same thing repeat many times. When the past returned in conversation, it did not arrive as a shared question. It arrived already shaped. The room rarely stopped to examine it. The version that appeared first usually remained in place long enough for the conversation to move forward. You noticed that the room did not seem interested in comparing details carefully. The discussion continued as soon as a version of the moment had been spoken. Once that version existed in the conversation, it quietly became the ground everyone stood on. Your memory sometimes held a slightly different version of the same moment, not dramatically different, just enough that you could feel the small space between what you remembered and what was now being repeated. At first, you treated that space as something temporary. You assumed the difference would correct itself if the moment was discussed again. Sometimes you mentioned a detail. Sometimes you added a sentence that brought your version into the room. But the conversation rarely paused long enough to examine that difference. More often, the room moved forward with the version that had already been accepted. The earlier moment became simpler as it was repeated. The details that complicated the story tended to disappear quietly along the way. You noticed what happened next inside yourself. When a conversation turned towards something that had already happened, you began to listen before you spoke. You waited to hear which version of the moment had already settled into the room. If your memory matched it closely enough, there was nothing to consider. But when the difference appeared, you felt a small calculation take place. You considered whether introducing your version would interrupt the direction the conversation had already chosen. Most of the time, you could feel the answer before you said anything. Eventually, you understood something simple. Your memory felt inconvenient. There was no moment when you formally decided to step back from your own memory. Nothing dramatic marked the change. No conversation announced that things would work this way from now on. It happened gradually. A moment from the past would come up in conversation. Someone would describe it. The room would accept the description and continue moving forward. The version spoken aloud would settle into place with quiet confidence. You would listen. Sometimes what you heard matched what you remembered closely enough that there was no difference worth noticing. The conversation would move along and you would move with it. Other times the difference would appear again. Not large, just enough that you could recognize the small distance between what you remembered and what was now being repeated. You began to notice what happened next. Before speaking, you would pause for a moment and look around the room. Not physically, just a quick internal check. You measured the direction the conversation had already taken. You noticed how settled the current version sounded. If the moment had already found its place inside the discussion, you often let it remain there. Sometimes you shortened what you remembered so it would fit more easily beside the version that had already been accepted. Sometimes you adjusted a detail so the conversation would not have to slow down. And sometimes you said nothing at all. The room continued moving forward either way. Over time, this became the quiet rhythm of these moments. The past would return in conversation. A version of it would take shape. The room would accept it and move on. You noticed that the conversation rarely needed your memory in order to continue. Eventually, something simple became clear enough that it no longer surprised you. When your memory felt inconvenient,